welcome back to the Startup Science Foundation podcast. Today we are joined by Greg Delaune. Greg, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Joe?
Doing well, doing well. So there's been a lot of buzz about, the project in French Polynesia, and I just want to first off find out what's your background and how did you get involved with the project?
Sure. So I actually come from architecture and then landscape architecture and urban design for grad school. And so I really came at this, or really come from a lot of environmental design and even economic development activities that I now do through an architecture and urban design approach, and really an environmental or urban planning, urban design. And as a result, I got into larger scale problems of economic development at a regional and in some cases even an international scale, and then ended up working on and focusing on, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, on public-private partnerships for green cities and smart cities, which would even include and go down to the scale of a public open space design, or thinking about how people physically experience cities, or what we sometimes call at UX global experience design for cities, and that can even be for events, etc. So that sort of ecosystem development, or in particular innovation ecosystem development, is really exactly what's going on with the Seasteading project and the design of these floating platforms, floating communities, and all of the things that will go into them that include some very sophisticated green and clean technologies, but also a lot of social innovation and opportunities for entrepreneurship, but then civic innovation as it relates not only to some of the ideas around experimenting with governance models, but also just generally how cities work, and how public and private entities or interests can work together for communities. So in the context of the Floating Island Project, the thinking about these aspects of cities and innovation ecosystems is something that's very important to the French Polynesian government and the French Polynesian people, but there was nobody particular on the team that was focused on these sorts of issues. So I was referred by a friend, Monty Cosma, who was advising for the Seasteading Institute, that I could bring something to the team that was headed to French Polynesia to meet our potential client and look at sites. And we started that discussion, and it went well. I actually met Randy for the first time after a phone call in the Bay Area. I met Randy Henkin, the executive director of the Seasteading Institute. I met him for the first time at Burning Man in his camp on Tuesday. And we got along well, and I ended up going with him to French Polynesia, and that was way back in September of 2016. So since then, we've come a long way, and I've been enjoying my work there.
Excellent. And so you mentioned that you worked a lot with urban design, urban planning, but how does that work in the context of seasteading? When people think of seasteading, they usually think of, exiting, highly malleable, very emergent, kind of anarchic. How can you sort of urban plan for a scenario like that?
Yeah, well, I think, particularly with some of the background of the Seasteading Institute and some of its libertarian roots, and the kind of focus on experimental government, experimental governance models, and how that relates to blockchain, et cetera. That's kind of what some people think about and associate with that. But really, particularly with Blue Frontiers and what we're doing in French Polynesia, but then also generally with seasteading, I think it's sort of the old story of, I think it's a blind man trying to describe an elephant, and there's a lot of different descriptions or things that come to mind. So when we talk to people about seasteading and about these new floating platforms in French Polynesia, some people are really curious about the food system. Some people are really curious about how the energy generation's going to work. Some people are curious about our interaction with the French Polynesian culture. Some people are just curious about the beautiful environment, and then some people are interested in the innovative governance models, or the idea of exiting from current systems. So for me in particular, that governance part is just one component, but a critical component for any seastead or any community to thrive is their physical environment. The health of that environment in terms of it being clean and well designed, so aesthetically, but then other aspects of how really ultimately how a community works, how a city works. And that has mechanical components in terms of infrastructure, but then also particular open space design, architectural design components, and experience design components that are the areas that I end up being particularly focused on.
Excellent. And a lot of these, the structure of these platforms, the platform themselves will be paid for by this this new token that you guys will be making. For those who do not know, the Blue Frontiers is conducting an ICO with Ccoin. And the aspects of the coin, which is a standard ERC20, is that that any purchase of Blue Frontier services, including making these platforms, will be facilitated by this token. So, in your view, what is the important aspect of this token within the Blue Frontier's business model?
Yeah, so that's been really exciting for me. Joe, you probably know more about, can talk more intelligently about the tokens than I can. I can tell you that for all the reasons they did ask me to join the team, it wasn't because of my blockchain knowledge. So, but it's an exciting component of the project as I've gotten to learn more and more about how everything fits together. And in particular, I'm interested in the potential for these sorts of blockchain technologies to come into play in terms of the project management of the building of the project itself, but then the day-to-day management of different components of the seasteads as they may relate to democratization of decision-making, actual voting, and then other governance components. The token, as well as these other components, are representative of our intent to build these communities not just on the most cutting edge physical floating green and clean infrastructure, but also on the most advanced and promising digital infrastructure. So again, I really think of all these things are sort of the parts of the whole in terms of building the community, and the token component obviously plays a huge potential component in terms of how some of the value flow will happen, but it's also a fundamental part of other components of how we'll manage and build the community.
Excellent. And hopefully, you know, having a digital infrastructure will make it easier to scale the seasteads. I know that a lot of people in the seasteader community, they see the Sea Zone as sort of a first step into scaling into a much larger project. In fact, maybe having a fully independent city-state or organization out in open waters. What does that look like from a technical standpoint, considering now with the Sea Zone you have these wave breakers, these natural wave breakers that allow, you know, for them to exist fairly peacefully without having to deal with as many waves?
Yeah, well, I know you have a bunch of seasteaders that attend your events and follow your work. So some of many folks will know that the Seasteading Institute's been around for over 9 years, and the long-term idea is to be in international waters on the open sea. And the focus now on French Polynesia was the intent to take baby steps, so to speak, so that rather than being on the open ocean, we're in these protected lagoons. And the big difference, or one of the key big differences, is the level of engineering and order of magnitude of construction costs that are associated with that engineering, such that in a platform on the open ocean where you could realistically have a community of this size, and we're saying about 200 for phase one, you're probably talking about hundreds of millions, if not approaching $1 billion in design and construction for the infrastructure, particularly for the prototype. Whereas for the project that we're talking about, for about a dozen platforms, about 25 meters square, and about 200 people, then we're talking about something in the $60+ million. So less than 10 or more, around $5 million per platform. So that, combined with the access to airports and the other synergistic opportunities with the local community, et cetera, it's really a different approach that we're taking right now, and we foresee doing that with other communities, other nations around the world, and then working our way up to eventually the cost and engineering involved with going out on the open sea, and then accordingly the added autonomy and potential for experimentation with government models that we would have in that kind of international environment.
Excellent. So while there are certainly benefits to being in the sea zone, one of them being technical and one of them being political, there's also tends to be some drawbacks dealing with the local community. Can you sort of talk about the reaction of the community in French Polynesia?
Yeah, well, for the most part, it's been extremely positive. It's the people of French Polynesia have a unique history, which involves some not so pleasant or pretty dramatic events like the testing of nuclear weapons that happened during the second half of the last century with the French government, and the experience of things as terrible as birth defects and other sorts of terrible physical impacts are one of the legacies of that nuclear testing. And as a result, it's really made people extremely and rightfully skeptical of the sorts of impacts that come in from outside cultures and outside investment. So the fear of outside investment and outside influence happens at the small scale in terms of the small communities, but then also overall on the different islands in the nation. So those are things that people can be skeptical, but as soon as people have found out about what our true intent is and the opportunities that we're bringing and the sorts of opportunities that we could bring for young Polynesians, but also in terms of green and clean technologies that could ultimately help the islands go 100% renewable energy and help them with their water issues, et cetera, and the economic partnerships that we're committed to, the reaction generally is very positive. What's happening right now is there's an election going on. The national election is going on, and the incumbent president and his party is definitely taking a little bit more of a conservative approach in terms of talking about the project and at the local level, and some of the cities that we're talking to. Also there, things, because of the election, are moving a little bit slower. But otherwise, the reaction's been very positive, and particularly even folks who are very skeptical of the project, as soon as they actually find out talk to some of our people like Mark Collins, who is our local French Polynesian founder and really one of the drivers of the project locally. As soon as they talk with Mark or somebody else and find out all the positive aspects of the projects, inevitably they become a proponent of the project. So in general, it's been a very positive experience, and we're confident that because of our good intent and the commitments we've made, that it's going to be a very fruitful and positive relationship.
So tell me, Greg, since you're making partnerships with the French Polynesian people, what are some ways that you're integrating into the French Polynesian economy?
Yeah, so the partnership opportunities are really broad in terms of that we want to be working with the local universities, even with local high schools and grade schools, but then also with the local acceleration and incubation community for how much it's started to take hold. So we are, aside from looking at technology transfer opportunities, like again helping with the islands going 100% renewable, there is the opportunity to be working with the local agricultural community and propagating the amazing innovations that are happening in terms of structured growing and other sorts of hydroponic technologies that are out there. But even beyond that, there's an accelerator in Papeete on Tahiti that's called Prism, and that is an accelerator that's now in its second cohort of about 7 to 10 French Polynesian startups. And we've already been working with them a little bit in terms of learning about their startups and looking for ways to support the acceleration activities that they're doing, and connecting Prism to the accelerators and incubators that exist in other parts of the world, in particular organizations like the Clean Tech Open with Clean Tech Accelerator I've been working with for about 5 or 6 years, and finding these synergies between activities that are going on in other parts of the world, so that young Polynesians who may have engineering or chemistry or other sorts of higher degrees from great universities around the world, that they can return to French Polynesia and use those degrees and have entrepreneurial activities, opportunities, and connect with resources in Silicon Valley and beyond, so that we're really helping create the next generation of innovators, particularly as it relates to the environmentally friendly or sustainable technologies that will drive the seastead, but can also benefit all of the people of French Polynesia. So that's something we're particularly excited about, and with all of the talent that we think will be attracting to the seastead, either just digital nomads that are doing their work online and can really work from anywhere on the globe and would choose to live there, to professors and high-level technicians and thought leaders from around the world that would be part of this new population of seasteaders. Those are all people that can have a positive influence and bring their talents to the local community, again, with the universities and high schools and other sorts of government efforts, but then also to create that exchange. So as we've gotten to know the French Polynesian people and their institutions and their unique relationship to the ocean and to the islands and to that ecology and ecosystem there's tremendous things that we can learn about their relationship to the ocean. And so a real opportunity for exchange there, and we think that's something that's going to be another added benefit for folks who choose to come live on the seastead.
Excellent. I've been so impressed about how well you guys integrated the French Polynesian people into the project, especially since other things you're involved with, like the Startup Society Summit, which is May 9th through the 10th at George Mason University, which you're going to be speaking at, is about integrating the Puerto Rican people into the global economy through special economic zones. How do you think that the Puerto Rican people can also benefit from something similar that's going on in French Polynesia?
Yeah, well, in terms of the network that we're building and the organizations that are working on related or synergistic problems around the world, what's going on in the Caribbean, in particular in Puerto Rico, to think about not just rebuilding, but rebuilding in a way that's going to be more resilient and is going to create opportunity with new technologies for the local people. That's something that is really transferable, not just to a seastead or to a French Polynesian environment, but we're also talking to folks like Mike Zuckerman, who works with the Institute for the Future and is focused on what is arguably the most dire humanitarian disaster in history, which is going on right now in Bangladesh. So the refugees from Myanmar and the infrastructure needs that they have, or the basic resource needs that they have in the refugee camps, and the flooding that they're going to be facing in the coming weeks from the monsoon season, that's another opportunity for not just floating platforms, but infrastructure and services that they will need. And there's interesting overlaps between those people's needs, or what's going on with that situation, and what's going on with the rebuilding in the Caribbean, and what's going on with French Polynesia and the seasteads. So what I'm really looking forward to And the opportunities I see is that with organizations like Solar Head of State, who we're talking to in the Caribbean, Build Back Aruba, the Foundation for Puerto Rico, who's working with you on the conference, with everybody in the room and everybody focused in on this common issue of building resilient communities, but building them with renewable energy and solid water infrastructure, water purification, wastewater treatment, other sorts of waste treatment, food systems, and all that. There's so much exciting overlap that can happen, and the outcome can ultimately be not only cleaner and smarter communities, but ultimately more resilient communities. And when we talk about resilient, we mean resilient in terms of being able to withstand storms and other sorts of natural disasters, but also economic resilience and even technical resilience in terms of adaptable technologies that will remain relevant for the coming years and are fundamentally built on the backbone of green and clean technologies that are going to be good for the environment. So I see a lot of great overlap there and a lot of opportunity to share technology and lessons learned around the globe. And the conference in May is going to be a great opportunity to bring a lot of those folks together in the same room and to look at how we can have global impact.
You heard it, folks. Join us May 9th through 10th because of Startup Society is a global phenomenon. And after Greg and crew at Blue Frontiers are done, everyone and their mother is going to be asking for their own Startup Society. So thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to talk to you always.
Of course.